I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 17. Birth of a New World Order. New York, New York. United Nations Headquarters. Secretary General Johann Baer of the United Nations sat in his office, looking out the large windows at the great city of New York before him. From his perch, he could see much of Manhattan and the surrounding harbor and waterways. As much as he loved the energized scene before him, he despised the nation it belonged to. To him, the United States was a parasite, a leech that was bleeding the world dry. Its never-ending thirst for energy and resources, and its perverse belief that somehow its people were more important than those of any other nation, made it a dangerous scourge. American exceptionalism. More like American imperialism if they don't get what they want, Baer thought. Like a petulant child, America would routinely lash out at various countries of the world when it didn't get what it wanted, using its economy and its military to bully smaller countries into submission. He found comfort that those days were quickly coming to an end. Only a few more days and America and the world will change for the better. Mr. Secretary General, said his assistant, breaking his trance and bringing him back to reality. He turned to look at his assistant and saw him walk in, accompanied by a Canadian general, a man by the name of Guy Mackenzie. The Canadian general had built a well-known reputation both within his own country's forces and those of the UN as a true warrior diplomat. He'd spent large portions of his career in the Canadian Special Forces, and then in various functions developing the small Canadian military into a well-trained professional force. He'd been the commander of numerous UN peacekeeping operations around the world. The few UN-led peacekeeping operations that hadn't been plagued by scandal or marred by indifference, like those in South Sudan, were the ones specifically led by Mackenzie. When it came time to develop a true UN standing army, there wasn't a single military officer in the world that held the level of respect needed to make this concept work other than General Guy Mackenzie. Secretary General Baer smiled warmly at the two men as he stood up to greet them. He'd been waiting all day for this meeting. Walking around his desk, he shook both of their hands excitedly. General, it's good to see you here in New York. How are things coming along? Rough around the edges, sir, but coming along, answered General Mackenzie in an upbeat tone. The Secretary General guided them over to a table at the far side of his office. Please, General, tell me how things are going, and what more I can do to help, or make calls to get things moving faster for you, Baer pressed. Mackenzie nodded. No disrespect, but is Mr. Vollmer cleared for this? He asked, tilting his head toward Bruno Vollmer, who was sitting next to the general. Baer waved the comment off. Bruno is fully aware of what we're doing. He's helping me orchestrate the political side of things here at the UN, so please feel free to speak freely in front of him. Very well, General Mackenzie responded. Then he opened a locked pouch he had with him and pulled out some papers and a folder to begin their discussion. The plans for the exercises are going well. We have advanced parties for the participating nations' militaries arriving this week. The United Nations Operation Restoring Order training exercise is shaping up to be a huge success. Wait, what are you calling it? Asked Bruno with a quizzical look on his face. The name for the operation had only been settled on a few days ago, so it was still not widely known. We settled on calling it Operation Restoring Order, since that's essentially going to be the function of the new standing army. For short, we're calling the training exercise UNORO. I guess you'd pronounce it UNORO. I don't mean to interrupt, But how many nations have finally agreed to participate? Secretary General Bear eagerly asked. He'd been so busy trying to get the political side of this exercise taken care of that he hadn't been able to delve too deeply into the nuts and bolts of the details. General Mackenzie smiled. As of right now, we have 42 nations participating in one form or another. The largest contributors to the exercise are France, Germany, Turkey, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Italy, and surprisingly, China and Russia have agreed to send forces as well. Many of the other nations are contributing less than 100 soldiers, mostly observers who will presumably report back on how well things go or don't go, so their home nations can determine if they want to support it and how many soldiers they want to commit. When the exercise is complete, we'll have a better idea of how many nations will want to contribute forces long-term to the standing army. Once I have those figures, I'll be able to develop my report of how many soldiers we'll need to recruit to fill out the gaps in the force, and that'll tell us what the costs will be. Looking at one of the papers he had pulled out, Mackenzie added, Of the major nations participating, this is the troop breakdown. China is sending a total of 3,500 soldiers, and most of the Chinese soldiers are part of their Air Force and Navy, no ground forces. Once they arrive in Vancouver, they will head to the Canadian Forces Base Comox, northwest of Vancouver. In addition to the Air Force, a total of 10 Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy ships will make a port call at Canadian Forces Base Esquimalt. The Russian Federation is sending 22,000 soldiers to participate in the exercises that will be taking place at the Canadian Forces Base in Trenton. In addition to the ground forces, the Russians are also going to send 2 squadrons of fighters to allow our NATO-based aircraft a chance to do some real training against some of their frontline fighters. We're actually really excited about this opportunity to train with the Russians and move from always viewing them as a foe to a new potential UN peacekeeping partner. Secretary General Bear grunted. He still had his suspicions about the Russians' motives, but at this point, he needed them. Germany is sending the largest contingent, 24,000 soldiers. Then France is sending 18,000 soldiers. He paused for a second as he rifled through the papers to find what he was looking for. Here it is. Turkey and Pakistan are sending a combined force of 9,000 soldiers, and the remaining countries have contributed a combined 17,000 soldiers. All in all, we're looking at having a total of 68,000 soldiers from all 42 nations. Bear let out a soft whistle. He was impressed that they were able to organize so many peacekeepers from so many different nations, in the dead of winter and traveling to Canada, no less. This is going to work out better than I'd hoped, he thought. Incredible, General, Bear said. Truly genius what you've been able to put together. This will be the largest UN military force since the Korean War. Smiling at the high praise, Mackenzie added, and it'll have all been done without any help from the Americans. A true effort by the nations of the world without having to rely on the United States to accomplish it. How are we getting all of these nations' military equipment moved to Canada? Bruno asked as he jotted down a note. Also, how long will the exercise last, and what are you doing to keep them all fed and occupied? General Mackenzie smiled at the questions, obviously not at all put off. For decades, the United Nations peacekeeping forces have been poorly trained and poorly led because the organization has been dependent on receiving whatever forces each member state is willing to loan us. In many cases, we've been handed poorly trained and poorly equipped units as the member states hoped these units would receive the training and experience they themselves were unable to provide. They were essentially just giving us warm bodies with little skills or experience and expecting us to somehow stop a civil war or impose peace on a war-torn nation with these inadequate forces. Unfortunately, this has resulted in an abysmal peacekeeping record and tarnished the UN's name. In some cases, we've caused more harm than good. Our track record in South Sudan and Somalia is a good case in point. Mackenzie looked sad as he mentioned those two countries. But then he perked back up. This training exercise is meant to address many of those problems. Mostly it's meant to fix our logistical problem of shipping a military force to a foreign land and then keeping that force supplied. In this case, we're relying heavily on nations like the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, France, China, and Russia to do most of the heavy vehicle and equipment transport. Most of the equipment is due to arrive on the east and west coasts of Canada in the next couple of days. From there, it'll be shipped via rail to the various Canadian military bases until the soldiers start to fly in from around the world. Most of the soldiers will start to arrive in Canada around November 3rd. Within 5 days, all participating soldiers will have arrived and will begin collecting their equipment and begin the process of getting it ready. Pulling out a calendar, Mackenzie added, "The first day of the military exercises will be November 7th, and they will continue for a full 45 days. When they're done, there will be a 5-day period where we'll conduct an after-action review of all the soldiers involved to find out what went right and what went wrong, so we can work on fixing the problems as they're identified." Bruno smiled and nodded at the information. He wrote a few other things down on his pad of paper before returning his gaze back to the general. "What are the exact scenarios you'll be training for?" Mackenzie nodded. "Well, in this case, we'll be training for a couple of scenarios. The first scenario is a restart of the Korean War. In this scenario, we'll be training our combat forces to carry out joint maneuvers to deal with a much larger North Korean ground force. Mostly, it'll be a lot of maneuver training, having units shift around from one base to another under strict timelines, while pretending to meet a specific North Korean division. It's a giant logistics and supply exercise, which is a huge challenge for any army to have to deal with. The second scenario is more in line with our traditional peacekeeping missions, helping to restore order in a country after a coup, or working with a local government to prevent a coup. This exercise will result in a lot of community interactions between UN forces, and training in how to properly handle those interactions. We've utterly failed in those areas in the past, so it's a much-needed exercise. What these exercises will also do is allow us to identify specific officers and NCOs inside of each host nation that may be better suited for future UN missions. This way, when a call goes out for a UN force in, say, Gabon or Sierra Leone, we can request specific officers and their units from a host nation and know those individuals have been properly trained and will react correctly in certain situations. Leaning forward, Bear asked, "And what about our test of the American aerospace defense networks? Have those units been briefed on what to do and what to look for?" Mackenzie nodded. "Yes, our Canadian officers serving at the joint U.S.-Canadian bases will be monitoring things from their end. As to our side of the border, the Russians and Germans were most eager to have an opportunity to buzz an American airbase and practice carrying out mock bombing missions. It'll give us a good test of the American aerospace defense system." Secretary General Bear beamed with pride as Mackenzie finished his brief. He couldn't be prouder of the UN or what it was transforming itself into. Since his time as the German foreign minister, he'd wanted to see not just a strong, dominant European Union emerge as a counterweight to the U.S., but a strong and effective United Nations. For decades, the UN had not only been a bloated bureaucracy that had proven to be largely useless, it had lacked any real teeth to enforce its mandates and policies. How many resolutions had the UN passed sanctioning North Korea, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, or even Israel for their inhumane treatment of the Palestinians? None of them were worth the paper they were written on without a standing army to enforce their edicts. For too long, any semblance of a UN army was forced to be made up of U.S. forces. This would ultimately mean the UN was used once again as the U.S.'s proxy weapon to advance their causes, their goals, even if it went against the good of the world. Looking at General Mackenzie with pride, Bear felt he was finally on the cusp of having the very tool every past UN Secretary General lacked, a real military force that could enforce its mandates. Chapter 18. Fate of the Republic. November 2nd, 2020, Washington, D.C., J. Edgar Hoover Building, FBI Headquarters. The polls were now less than 36 hours from opening, and the FBI was still no closer to stopping the impending terrorist attacks than they had been 2 days earlier. The information they had received from Kosovo had enabled them to arrest 2 individuals, but they had yet to find the rest of their cell or the others involved in the plot. When they had raided the home being used by the 2 individuals, they had discovered something truly horrifying. Their 2019 GMC Savannah cargo van had been turned into a giant mobile version of a Claymore anti-personnel mine. When the bomb squad had torn the vehicle apart, they'd seen that the inner walls of the van had been covered in several layers of tiny steel ball bearings. Behind the ball bearings was a layer of C4, which would act as the propellant that would throw the ball bearings in a wide arc away from the vehicle. The terrorists had even shaped steel plates to fit behind the explosives, to further ensure the pressure from the blast expanded out in the direction they wanted it to go. They had even marked the van to look like a police evidence van, complete with all of the proper markings, vehicle numbers, and everything needed to make it look official. They still hadn't figured out how the terrorists had planned on using it or where it was going to be detonated, but based on the type of explosives they'd found and the way it was configured with the ball bearings, they knew it was going to be used against a soft target, a place where lots of people would be gathering together. At precisely 9:07 a.m., Attorney General Malcolm Wright and one of his aides walked unannounced into FBI Director Nolan Polanski's office. Looking up, a bit surprised by the sudden appearance of the AG, he stammered, I wasn't expecting you, sir. What can I do for you?" With a bit of heat in his voice, Malcolm said, "I need to know where we stand in the questioning of these terrorists. You've had them in custody now for a day, and we still don't know who their co-conspirators are or where they are planning to carry out this next attack. I need answers, Nolan. I've got the president breathing down my neck, and the election is tomorrow." Angrily, Director Polanski shot back, "I don't know, Malcolm. We've been pressing them non-stop since we detained them. They've freaking lawyered up on us, and somehow the ACLU got wind that we've detained suspected terrorists, and now I've got them breathing down my back, demanding that they be arraigned and allowed representation." The FBI director slumped dejectedly in his chair, frustrated that his agents weren't getting the information they needed fast enough. He knew they were on the clock. A terrorist attack was going to happen tomorrow, and thus far he was powerless to stop it. Malcolm wasn't having it. He slammed his hand down on his desk, jarring Polanski back to reality. "Damn it, Nolan! You're the director of the FBI. Use every tool you have at your disposal to get them talking. As to the ACLU, tell me who's giving you grief and allow me to handle them. These guys fall under the Patriot Act. They have no rights. They don't get to see a lawyer. And furthermore, they're not even U.S. citizens. Get me answers, Nolan, and stop this terrorist attack from happening." The two of them sat there for a moment, staring at each other without saying a word, before Director Polanski finally nodded. He picked up the phone on his desk and spoke a few hushed words to someone on the other end. "I've relayed your concerns, Malcolm. They'll amp up the pressure on them." He crossed his arms. "You'd better not burn me on this later," he retorted. He was frustrated that while his agency wasn't breaking the rules, they were certainly about to bend them to get the answers the AG wanted in the time frame they were given. If another attack happens, Nolan, it'll be both our heads. So let's just focus on getting these guys. Now, what have your people figured out regarding the poisoning of the Supreme Court justices? Malcolm asked. We believe they may have been poisoned while they were in deliberations sometime early last week. Sadly, the last 4 justices will die either today or sometime tomorrow. The radiation poisoning was just too severe for them to be saved. Shaking his head, the AG asked, Have we figured out how they were poisoned yet? The best we've been able to determine is that they were probably fed the poison in their drinks sometime last week. We've scoured the kitchen and interrogated all but one of the staff members that work there. The remaining staff member is on a pre-approved vacation, so we'll interview her when she returns. So far, we haven't been able to find any traces of the polonium. Chances are, whatever was used to poison them with has already been thoroughly cleaned, and the half-life of the stuff is fairly short. In a way, we're lucky it wasn't placed in the HVAC system of the building. Had it been, it could have poisoned hundreds of people. Malcolm snorted. I'm not as worried about a few hundred people being killed, so much as the fact that between today and tomorrow, all 9 Supreme Court justices will be dead at the same time. This is far more catastrophic to the fabric and stability of our nation than a few hundred visitors, lawyers, and petitioners before the court. The FBI director found himself in agreement at the morbid assessment. What's the president going to do about the justices? We can't have a Supreme Court completely unable to hear cases, especially given the current executive order about the election. Has anyone officially determined what's going to happen with that? We're kind of running out of options and time. Shaking his head, Malcolm rubbed the right side of his head with his hand. He looked at his colleague with sadness and uncertainty written on his face. I don't know, Nolan. I just don't know what to do anymore. The president needs to nominate new judges. But the country is still mourning their loss. Not to mention we have an election tomorrow that, in all honesty, is probably not going to be legit. You've seen the pundits and what the Tate campaign is putting out there. They've whipped people up, saying this whole terrorist plot and these postal workers the FBI arrested are just a diversion from Sachs losing. You and I know that's ridiculous, but how do we convince the other half of the country that's drinking the Tate Kool-Aid? We let the terrorists carry out their attack tomorrow. When they see a few dozen bombs go off, they'll know we weren't lying or making this crap up. The FBI director responded flippantly. He immediately regretted that he'd said that out loud, instead of keeping it in his head. Malcolm's jaw dropped in shock. Director Polanski held up a hand. I'm sorry, I didn't really mean that. I've gone over the TDAC report on the truck bomb we've already captured. These are horrific bombs if they do end up going off. Malcolm shook his head, obviously angry and disgusted. Look, Nolan, I know we're all under a ton of pressure, but pull it together, man. You've got thousands of agents looking to you for leadership right now. I may be out of a job depending on how the election goes tomorrow, but you'll still be here, and we need you to finish this job. You've got to find out who all is involved in this conspiracy. Someone deliberately poisoned the Supreme Court justices, just as they were about to hear perhaps the most important case in our generation. There are a series of terrorist attacks planned against our country. They weaponized social media to turn citizens against each other, and now we discover postal workers stealing the absentee ballots? You couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. And yet it's all happening right before our very eyes. Malcolm paused and leaned forward. You have to figure out who's behind all this before it's too late. The fate of our entire republic is hanging in the balance. Chapter 19, Election Day, November 3rd, 2020, White Settlement, Texas, White Settlement Public Library. It was 9:03 a.m., and the line was only just now moving. Dwight Larson stood patiently in line with the dozens of other folks who must have had the same idea he'd had, to vote as soon as the polls opened and save himself the hassle of waiting in what he thought would be a much longer, slower-moving line later in the afternoon. Under any normal circumstance, Dwight would already be at work. His shift at the Lockheed Martin plant just down the road started at 8 a.m. However, he had already told his boss the day before that he'd be late coming into work today so he could vote. While his shift would usually end early enough for him to cast his vote before the polls closed, no one wanted to wait around to the last minute, when the lines were usually longest. No. Today he wanted to get in and get out, especially with all the warnings about a possible terrorist attack. Steadily, the line that had snaked around the library moved forward. For perhaps the first time, Dwight noticed 5 heavily armed soldiers standing near the door. They weren't checking people's IDs, but they were giving everyone the once-over, probably trying to make sure no one stuck out. Well, at least the government placed armed security at the voting station, Dwight thought as he inched closer to the door. It was on every voter's mind that they didn't want to experience an attack like what had happened during early voting. A few more minutes went by, and then Dwight was able to make his way into the library. He walked up to the registration table and handed the elderly volunteer his voter ID card. She asked him several questions and then had him sign the electronic signature pad. She compared the signature to his ID and voter registration card and then smiled warmly as she handed back his cards. When he'd put away his cards, she handed him his ballot. "Here you go, Mr. Larson. Just pick an open station, fill in the circles, and place your voting card in the scanner at the far end of the room," she instructed. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, before taking his ballot and making his way to one of the voting booths. Dwight used the provided marker to fill in the circle, selecting Sachs for president, and then he voted for the sitting senator and congressman from his district. Despite what was going on in the world, things were generally going well for the Larson household. So in Dwight's mind, if things were good, why change it up? Just as he finished filling in the last ballot measure, which took him forever to read through, he heard a loud screeching of tires and then some excited shouting. A woman screamed, and then gunfire punctured the eerie silence. Pop, 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 pop. Then the loudest, most earth-shattering explosion rocked Dwight's world as the windows overlooking the parking lot exploded into 1,000,000 tiny shards. The wall itself imploded with a force Dwight did not think possible as chunks of wood, cinder block, and other debris slammed into every possible part of his body, hurling him backwards. For a few moments, Dwight found himself staring at the ceiling, but somehow seeing burning pieces of paper raining down and the occasional flash of the morning sky. He crinkled his forehead. How am I seeing the sky if I'm still inside the library? He wondered. His mind had not yet registered that close to half of the library had just been completely torn apart. The roof of the building had been ripped off like a metal can being peeled open. Moments later, the morning sky started to turn dark as Dwight's world slipped away into oblivion. River Oaks, Texas. River Oaks City Hall. The parking lot at City Hall was jam-packed this morning, and it was only 9:06 a.m. Kimberly Wilson had finally given up on finding a parking spot and just parked in front of someone's house a block away. She hoped the owner wouldn't be too mad at her parking her car there. She wanted to cast her vote and get on to work. Granted, she didn't have to be at the hair salon until 10 a.m., but judging by the number of people already in line, it might take her more than a few minutes to get through and vote. As she walked toward City Hall, she spotted what she thought was the end of the line, so she started walking in that direction. When she neared the end of the gaggle of people, Kimberly heard a series of soft popping sounds, almost like someone was lighting off some firecrackers. Everyone turned their heads toward the noise. Kimberly and several others instinctively dove to the ground, seeking cover. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out her concealed carry weapon. She looked up to see several other men and women from the line reaching into their sweaters, jackets, and handbags for their pistols. This is Texas, after all, she thought. "Look, over there!" shouted one of the men. A woman let out a scream. A plume of inky black smoke rose into the sky, a stark contrast to the bright blues of the mid-morning. "Everyone stay calm," shouted a police officer who was now walking down the row of people toward the smoke. "If I could get everyone to put their personal weapons away, it would greatly help us in making sure we don't accidentally shoot someone," the officer announced loud enough for everyone to hear. The crowd began to react to what he had said, holstering their guns. A moment later, several armed soldiers came trotting toward the crowd from around the front of City Hall. "If we could get everyone to leave the area, we're not sure if this polling station may be attacked next," shouted what appeared to be a sergeant. "If we leave now, when are we going to be able to vote?" shouted an angry older man who was sporting a hat from the president's party. With a look of concern written on his face, the soldier replied, "I don't know, sir. Maybe if you're willing to wait a little while, we could get you guys in. However, right now, I don't know if our polling station is next," he reiterated. His explanation was more than enough for a large swath of the crowd to start dispersing quickly to get out of there. Kimberly debated whether to leave. She wouldn't be able to leave work to vote later, so this was really her only chance. A few folks continued arguing with the soldier and the police officer, and she and a few others sort of milled about, unsure what to do. Suddenly, from around the corner, she heard the sound of automatic rifle fire. The soldiers immediately ran around the corner to find out what the heck was going on, and Kimberly found herself following the remaining people in line to see what had happened. The lone police officer gave up trying to tell people to stay back and joined the crowd. When she came around the corner, she saw a white cargo van riddled with bullet holes. There was a bright red blood splotch splattered across the remains of the shattered windshield. A lone soldier stood next to the front of the Toyota Camry, his M240 Golf set up with its bipod extended on the hood of the car and a slew of spent shell casings at his feet. He still had the machine gun trained on the van as another soldier, his rifle at the ready, moved in to make sure the driver was dead. Specialist Jose Ramirez held his M4 tight to his shoulder, his finger on the trigger, ready to send a fury of bullets into the driver's side of the van if he thought he saw movement. "How'd I draw the short stick to go check and see if this freaking terrorist is dead?" he thought to himself as he inched ever closer to the driver's side door of the van. When Jose got to within maybe 10 feet of the van, he saw the driver, bleeding from multiple gunshots. Looking at his face, he saw blood coming from his mouth. "Thank God he's dead," he thought. Just then, the man moved his head and looked directly at him. While spitting up blood, the terrorist smiled before he detonated the bomb in the van. In the blink of an eye, a massive blast tore Specialist Jose Ramirez into a fine red mist as he disappeared in the conflagration that consumed the nearby vehicles and building. Thousands of steel ball bearings were thrown in every direction, cutting down anyone in their path, killing and injuring dozens of people who had thought they were safe just moments ago. Within minutes, the Islamic State in Serbia had attacked 2 different voting stations in the Fort Worth area of Texas, striking fear into the heart of every American as they began to head to the polls to choose the next president. Arlington, Virginia, Pentagon. Secretary of Defense Chuck McElroy couldn't believe what he was seeing unfold across the various news outlets. When he heard of the first attack, he immediately ran down to the ops center in the bowels of the Pentagon. They had 2 of the monitors there tuned to the news outlets, as they described what appeared to be a pair of bombings in the Fort Worth area. Before McElroy could even ask for a sitrep, reports came in of a similar pair of attacks in Florida, one in Tampa and another in Kissimmee. That's just miles away from Disney World, thought McElroy. Seconds after those attacks happened, several more took place in Ohio, and then Pennsylvania and North Carolina. The country was under attack, and his forces had proven powerless to stop them. The red phone near the head of the table in the ops center rang. Everyone knew this was the direct hotline between the president and the SecDef, and all eyes turned to him as he reached for the phone. "This is McElroy," he said, very matter-of-fact. "I want the alert level raised across the country to threat condition Delta." "Yes, Mr. President, I agree. Start executing whatever operations you can in the Balkans, regardless of whatever the host nations think about it. I don't care what those leaders think anymore." "I agree. I think the situation has changed. We'll make the adjustment, Mr. President," McElroy responded. "Shall I move us from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 3? "What do you think?" Sachs asked sarcastically. "Obviously. Ground all the air traffic immediately and close all land and seaports." He took a deep breath and let it out. "Chuck, I'm authorizing the use of deadly force to defend our installations and strategic assets. If you see something suspicious, I don't want you to think about it, just shoot it. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. President." "Good. Now get the Air Force to spin up some fighters and start flying combat patrols over all of our strategic assets in major cities. That includes oil and natural gas terminals, ports, the works, not just the military installations. Okay?" "Yes, Mr. President." "All right, Chuck. I'll leave it to you then." The line went dead, and McElroy hung up the receiver. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Austin Peterson, asked, "What did he say? What are our orders?" McElroy relayed the details of the conversation. General Peterson and the Air Force chief acknowledged the orders and rushed off to get the ball rolling. The nation was moving to a war footing. As soon as they had a target to blow up or shoot, they'd hammer it. Washington, D.C., J. Edgar Hoover Building, FBI Headquarters. Ashley walked into Deputy Director Joseph Luttrell's office with a purpose. She needed to speak to him immediately. When she walked in, he shot her a look of contempt before he held up a hand and pointed at the phone in his other hand. She nodded and bit her lip to keep herself from speaking. "Yes, sir. I know we failed to find the bombers. They're detonating bombs across half a dozen cities right now." Audible yelling could be heard from the receiver as Joe held it back from his ear just a bit. Whoever is on the other end of that call is really laying into Joe right now, Ashley thought. She felt a bit relieved that it wasn't her on the receiving end. "No, sir. I cannot say with certainty that there are no more attacks. The attacks took place within the first 30 minutes of the polls opening. For all we know, the terrorists could be staggering their attacks. This could continue to take place throughout the entire day." Joe not only looked defeated at having failed in preventing these attacks from happening, he seemed apoplectic at the fact that he couldn't even strike back at the people responsible for this horrific carnage. "I don't know if we'll be ready to deliver our report by tomorrow," he said. Ashley scrunched up her face at the comment. Is he talking about my report? She wondered. She'd been close to being done before she'd just uncovered a whole new angle to this plot. Joe let out an audible sigh as he nodded, more to himself than the person he was speaking to on the other end. "Yes, sir. We'll personally deliver the report to the White House tomorrow by 10 a.m., and we'll be ready to brief it to the President and whoever you believe should hear it." Now Ashley was concerned. If they wanted to brief her report to the President, it just wasn't ready yet. "I understand. We'll plan on being at the White House for the rest of the day then." "Yes, we'll be ready to brief the press if the President asks us to." "Yes, sir. I'll call you if we have anything else new to report to you before the end of the day," Joe said. Then he hung up the phone. He looked at Ashley and shook his head. Before she could say anything, he got up and walked over to the window that looked out onto the city. It was a dreary day. Low clouds hung dark and ominously across the city, threatening to unload a torrent of rain or sleet. Ashley imagined that the sky looked how he felt, dark and depressed. "Who is that on the phone giving you the 3rd degree?" Ashley finally asked, breaking the silence. Turning around, Joe took a deep breath and straightened his back. "That was the Attorney General. He couldn't get through to the director, so I was the next best thing." "Where's the director?" asked Ashley. "In a plane, heading down to Orlando with several dozen agents. Apparently one of the attackers was captured during a shootout with the police. He's injured, but not critically, so the director is headed there with an enhanced interrogation team and additional agents." Ashley shook her head. "Geez, this is terrible. I can't believe what's going on." Brushing the comment aside, Joe asked, "What did you need, Ashley? You came in here looking like you were ready to unload on me." She blushed at the remark, realizing that she had come into his office in a huff-and-puff manner. "I've got another crinkle in our report I'm working on." "Oh, man," said Joe. "Please tell me it's not falling apart on us." She shook her head. "No, it's actually getting more complicated." Pointing to the 2 chairs opposite his desk, he led her over to sit down and talk about it. "What more have you found?" he asked. "You remember how the AG and the president had a special EO signed, unleashing the NSA and all of its capabilities to track down the October 31st attackers?" she asked. Joe nodded. "Yeah. To be honest, I was a bit concerned about taking the leash off the NSA. What did they come up with?" he asked. "Without exception, all of the attackers, the October 24th group, the Halloween cohort, and I'll wager the group that's carrying out the current attack will fall into this group as well, all entered the U.S. using EU passports, German passports to be more precise." She pulled some papers out of her folder and showed him copies of the passports. "They could have obtained stolen passports or bought them illegally. It does happen, Ashley." She nodded. "It does. But what doesn't happen is that these individuals also used spoofed biometrics." He lifted his head in surprise. "Explain," he ordered. "The other day, I met with National Security Advisor Robert Gray. He had another person from the NSA, Leah Riesling, brief me as well. She's apparently their counterintelligence department chief. She walked me through the process of how the attackers gained entry into the country. Essentially, what they did was use fake fingerprints that matched the biometrics of German citizens who these passports actually belonged to. The problem is, these German citizens are all currently serving various prison sentences in Germany, so there would be no way they could travel to the U.S. with their passports. Someone swapped out the facial images on the passports with those of the attackers, then gave them fake fingerprints to place over their real ones, kind of like tape. That way, when their fingerprints were scanned, they'd match the fingerprints on the electronic chip in the passports and the German government's own database, which allows DHS to carry out a one-for-one verification when one of their citizens travels to the U.S. Joe held up a hand. "So, how did the NSA know these were spoofed?" Ashley explained how the facial images captured at the U.S. port of entry matched several images the DoD had on record as belonging to members of ISIS or one of the other Islamic extremist groups. She showed Joe how some of these individuals had previously traveled through Ankara, Turkey, during the heyday of ISIS, and then a few other times they had been captured by either drone surveillance or other countries' passport control points. Once they knew one of the entries was spoofed, they immediately checked all of the passports of every German and then every other EU passport holder that entered the U.S. over the last 90 days. That's how they found the other attackers. It's also how they found the identity of the Halloween attackers before they were able to carry out their attacks. Once they knew what to look for, they were able to quickly figure out what passports were spoofed versus those that weren't. The NSA essentially hacked into the German prison system and compared the biometrics of the passports against the people currently serving a prison sentence. If this is true, then the terrorists must have had help from someone in Germany. Someone who has some serious pull within their government, Joe said. He continued to look over the information Ashley was giving him. Much of what she'd handed him was classified top secret or ORCON by the NSA. Well, as you know, that EO was only good for a couple of days, so Leah's group used it for all it's worth, Ashley said. They hacked into the BND system and discovered someone within German intelligence had assisted the attackers with the spoofed biometrics and passports. There, she'd said it. She dropped the bombshell discovery the NSA had just told her about right before the terrorist attacks. Joe looked at Ashley for a moment, calculating what he'd just been told. She could see the conflict in his face, and she was pretty sure she had an idea of what he was thinking, since she had thought the same things. The electronic evidence the NSA had provided was pretty convincing, but it just didn't jibe with what they knew of the Germans. It made no sense. How does any of this fit with what we know, Ashley? Joe finally asked. I mean, what's the endgame here? The Germans helping Islamic extremists infiltrate the U.S. to carry out a terrorist attack? The Chinese stealing mail-in and absentee ballots? And the Russians carrying out all sorts of cyber attacks and misinformation campaigns against the country? We're missing something here, Ashley, and we need to figure out what it is before we provide this report to the president. Ashley nodded. They had most of the pieces to this jigsaw puzzle, but they still couldn't fully decipher the larger image. Cleveland, Ohio, Senator Marshall Tate's campaign headquarters. Watching the horrific scenes of the attack in Orlando at downtown Disney of all places, Marshall couldn't help but wonder if this was all being orchestrated for his benefit. Was I wrong to oppose the president in postponing the election? He wondered. All of these people were dead now, and he'd done nothing to stop it. He shook his head. He knew it wasn't his fault. It was the FBI and Homeland Security who'd failed to identify these attackers and prevent them from carrying out this dastardly attack. Jerome Powell, his chief of staff, walked up and sat down on the empty chair next to him. He muted the TV. When you win tonight, you'll have a chance to go after the monsters responsible for this, he said, as he placed a hand on the senator's shoulder. Marshall snorted at the comment. It won't bring any of the people back who died today, he retorted. No, but it'll make the rest of the country feel good, and it'll solidify you as a decisive commander-in-chief, Jerome countered. You really think we're going to win today, even in spite of everything that's happened? Marshall asked. Jerome smiled at the question. Of course we're going to win. I don't mean to be crass, but these attacks aren't exactly taking place in Democratic strongholds. That's a terrible thing to say, Jerome, Marshall shot back. They're still Americans. Not looking the least bit hurt by the rebuke, Jerome replied, They are Americans. Americans that would have voted against you, and in all likelihood would have opposed you once you won. I'm not saying it's good that they were killed. I'm just saying these attacks are going to seriously depress the voter turnout in these districts, and probably the rest of the country. Low voter turnout favors us, Marshall. Shaking his head, Marshall shot back, I don't even know what to say to that. Don't ever trivialize people like that in front of me again. Do you understand? Jerome solemnly nodded. I agree we're probably going to win, but we're still going to need to deal with the aftermath of this attack. We can't come across like this helped us and hurt Sachs, or it'll be seen as us supporting or condoning it. That's a line we cannot cross, Marshall said with a sternness in his voice that Jerome had rarely heard. Jerome nodded again, but didn't say anything further. Instead, he got up and made a few calls on his smartphone to get a feel for how the attacks were affecting voter turnout in some of the other key states and districts they were monitoring. Arlington, Virginia, Pentagon. Secretary of Defense McElroy walked back into the National Military Command Center after receiving an urgent call from the duty officer. It was now 1707 hours, and while no additional terrorist attacks had happened, the country was still reeling from the slaughter that had taken place in the morning. McElroy identified the officer who'd called him and walked up to him. "What's going on, General?" he asked. The Air Force Brigadier General had a phone to his ear. He moved it down to his shoulder. "We've got a problem up north near the Canadian border, sir," he said. "What problem?" McElroy asked, crossing his arms. The general held an index finger up as he spoke into the phone. "You tell those pilots if those fullbacks cross into U.S. airspace again, they're cleared to engage them. We've already informed the Canadians and the rest of the world that U.S. airspace is closed to anything but military traffic. Any transgression of that will be treated as hostile." The general then hung up the phone and turned back to face the SecDef. "Sir, there's a serious issue." He paused for a second to take a swig of water. "As you know, the Canadians are hosting a large UN training exercise right now." The SecDef nodded. "Yeah, we've known about this for the better part of the year. So what's going on that's caused you to call me down here?" he asked, a little irritated that the general wasn't just getting to the point. "Well, sir, when we closed U.S. airspace after the terrorist attacks and moved the country to DEFCON 3, our airspace along the Canadian border has been getting probed on and off all day by several squadrons of Russian and Chinese aircraft. We've even had a pair of German Eurofighter Typhoons penetrate our airspace and buzz Fort Drum." A look of shock came across McElroy's face. "When the hell did that happen? And why wasn't I told?" he demanded. Looking a bit flustered, the general replied, That happened about 3 hours ago, but what really caused a problem and a near shoot-down is what occurred 10 minutes ago. A pair of Russian fullbacks, Su-34s, penetrated our airspace in North Dakota and carried out what we can only infer was a simulated attack run on Minot Air Force Base." McElroy could feel his face flush red with anger. "Holy crap! That's a nuke base!" he roared. "Get me the base commander now, and someone else get me the president. He has to know about this." A moment later, the red phone was handed to him, and he angrily grabbed the receiver. "Mr. President, we have a serious problem, and I need your authorization to handle it," he said forcefully. For the next couple of minutes, he brought the president up to speed. Sachs was furious. "I'm going to place a call to the Canadian Prime Minister and the Secretary General at the UN right now. I'll tell them that if any additional aircraft participating in their little training exercise penetrate U.S. airspace again, or even come close to one of our military installations, it will be shot down. After all that's gone on today, for them to run military drills unannounced against our military bases... No, Chuck. You tell our fighters to attack any aircraft that penetrate our airspace until we downgrade our defense posture. We still don't know if there are more attacks planned." The president then hung up the phone, presumably to go chew out the Canadian PM and that pompous UN Secretary General. After hanging up the red phone, Chuck signaled that he wanted the phone that connected him to the base commander at Minot. When he finally got through to the colonel, he explained to him in no uncertain terms that if another foreign fighter buzzed his base again, he'd be relieved on the spot and forced into retirement. The colonel hastily replied, "Mr. Secretary, I have a fleet of B-52 bombers and missile silos, but I don't have any fighters or air defense systems here. How am I supposed to shoot down foreign fighters that attempt to fly over my facility?" "That's a damn good question," thought Chuck angrily. "Colonel, wait one moment," he said, as he quickly turned to the duty officer. "What's the nearest fighter assets we have to Minot that can deploy right now?" Looking at a clipboard that one of the senior NCOs handed him, the general replied, "We have the 366th Fighter Wing out of Mountain Home, Idaho. It's an F-15E wing. We've also got the 388th Fighter Wing out of Hill Air Force Base, Utah. They're an F-35 wing. Tell the wing commander out of Hill to get some F-35s up there now, the SecDef demanded. I want his wing to start providing round-the-clock coverage of the border until told otherwise. Also, tell the wing commander at Mountain Home to get his birds up there too. Those Russian and Chinese aircraft probably won't see the F-35s, but they sure as hell will see the F-15s. Tell them I want their search radars on to make sure everyone across the border knows we're on to their little games. A flurry of activity began to take place. McElroy thought for a moment. All of this was happening under the auspices of the UN and in full coordination with the Canadians. Crap, there's Canadians at NORAD, he realized. Get me the commander at NORAD, he barked. Also, send an alert to our guys over at Eastern Air Defense Sector in Rome, New York. Tell them that until further notice, they're to lock out their Canadian counterparts. I want them escorted from the facility. When all this crap gets cleared up, they can return to work with my sincerest apologies. But for right now, I'm not going to allow the Canadians to see what type of air defense we're coordinating in response to this aggression being carried out by this UN exercise. The last thing we need is for them to have an inside track into what we're doing. Is that understood? The color drained from the Air Force duty officer's face. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, we hadn't even thought about that. They probably saw our response, or rather lack thereof, when those Eurofighters buzzed drum and figured they could do the same with Minot. Hell, they've had a complete mirror image of what NORAD's seeing, so they've known all along where our fighters are currently positioned. He let out a stream of expletives. If that had been a real attack, they could have sacked most of our nuclear capability. McElroy nodded. Exactly. Get those links cut off. We can reestablish them after this UN exercise is done. But for the time being, we're not allowing the nations participating in the exercise to have access to NORAD or know our full capabilities. Chuck shook his head in frustration and anger. How much have the Russians and Chinese possibly seen already? He thought. New York, New York, UN Headquarters. My apologies, Mr. President. I don't know what General Mackenzie was thinking, allowing his air assets to penetrate U.S. airspace on a day like this. I will speak with him immediately about this, Johann said, as he tried his best to conceal his contempt for the U.S. President. In a few more hours, you'll have lost your re-election, and we won't have to deal with you anymore, he thought. If your peacekeepers cross our border again, I will order them to be shot down, Sachs asserted. Yes, Mr. President, again, I am sincerely sorry about this. I am sure it was a mistake. I doubt General Mackenzie would have allowed his forces to run simulated bombing runs against your bases. It was probably a couple of rogue pilots. The conversation lasted another 60 seconds before it finally ended. Once it had, Johann let out a guttural laugh of satisfaction. Then he hoped that Mackenzie had gotten the information he'd needed. Those Russians almost blew it for us, he thought. Lifting his secured phone, he placed a call to the good general. Mackenzie sounded like he smiled when he picked up the phone. Ah, Mr. Secretary General, I hope all is well, he said jovially. He began to chuckle. I take it you just got a call from the American president? Mackenzie asked between laughs. I did indeed. The pompous little idiot berated me for allowing you to run amok with your training exercise. He said to tell you if you try to run practice bombing runs across his border again, he'll have your aircraft shot down, Bear replied, a bit amused at the conversation and not taking Sachs seriously for a minute. A moment of silence ensued before General Mackenzie replied, I think he may actually do that, sir. Bear furrowed his brow. Why do you say that? He's about to lose his re-election, and his country just suffered yet another terrorist attack. He wouldn't dare. Mackenzie let out a sigh that carried through the phone. That's exactly why he might shoot down one of our fighters. They were just brutally attacked. I was told the death toll has reached almost 1,000. Their military is trigger-happy right now. Not only that, I was told our access to NORAD and the Eastern Air Defense System was just cut off. The deputy commander at NORAD is a Canadian general, and he phoned me, telling me his entire staff was being escorted out of NORAD and would remain cut off until our UN exercise was concluded. Bear recalculated. He hadn't expected that kind of response, certainly not before the election had concluded. "Does this change any of our plans?" he asked, now a bit concerned. "No, not yet at least. It might, depending on whether or not Sachs opts to leave peacefully or will need to be given a swift kick in the backside. I don't recommend we test their airspace again, though. I think we accomplished what we needed to this afternoon, so there's really no need to test them further." Nodding more to himself than for the benefit of Mackenzie, Bear agreed. The two of them talked for a bit more before they hung up. They knew there would be a lot to discuss in the coming days, once the American election had concluded. Chapter 20. Post-Election Meltdown. November 4th, 2020, Washington, D.C., Nebraska Avenue Complex, Department of Homeland Security. It was 8:22 a.m. by the time DHS Secretary Patricia Hogan had finished reviewing the post-election analysis of the various districts in the swing states that had ultimately decided the election. Her forehead crinkled as she stared at the data with eyes that were bloodshot from lack of sleep. "What am I looking at?" she finally asked. "What's wrong with this picture?" Neil Curtis, the chair of the Federal Election Commission, whose team had been up all night and this morning compiling this brief, replied, "We normally don't go this deep into the voting data, but the party chairs for the states of Florida, North Carolina, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Ohio all sent us some rather disturbing data following the closing of the polls last night. Their concerns were further validated by the RNC's data and the Sachs campaign data. Based on historical data of past elections, it is very clear that there was a high level of either voter suppression or outright manipulation of votes." She lifted her head up a bit. "That's a big statement to make. How are you guys coming to that conclusion?" she asked. He bit his lower lip before he answered. "Let me pull up Broward County in Florida for you as an example." He turned his laptop toward her so she could see what he was talking about. An image of the country was brought up, along with a lot of voter data. "Let me show you this to give you a reference point. In 2012, during the Obama-Romney election, the Democrats won the district with 67.2% of the vote, while the Republicans received just 32.3%. In the 2016 presidential election, the Republicans received 260,951 votes, or 31.2% in that county. In the 2018 midterms, that number was 220,012, or approximately 31.3% of the vote. While the number was lower, it was still proportional when looked at in comparison to the number of people who voted in the midterms, which is always lower than in a presidential year. You can see from the data. During the last several election cycles, Republicans only went down 1% in their share of the vote. Now, this is obviously a Democratic stronghold, and the Republicans do not tend to do well in those districts. But historically, the Republicans have nearly always polled around 31% of the vote. However, yesterday, the Republicans obtained just 18% of the vote in that same district. That's a full 13% drop in just a 2-year period. She pulled at her ponytail. "Couldn't that just be attributed to the terrorist attacks that happened in Orlando and Tampa?" she asked. Neil replied, "It could, if that held true for all voter turnout across the entire state, but not for a single party, and not in just 4 districts in the state. What makes this more problematic, though, is that we have seen this same exact trend play out in West Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and Orange County. This drop-off in Republican votes in these Democratic strongholds was enough of a change that it tipped Florida into Tate's favor. "What about the other states?" Patty asked. Neil nodded. "It's the same in the other Democratic strongholds in the other 4 states. A significant drop-off of 10 or more percentage points, resulting in just enough votes to tip the states in Tate's favor." He sighed before adding, "I fear that the information about the postal workers intercepting mail-in and absentee ballots in these districts may have actually tilted the entire election in Tate's favor, and furthermore, there were probably other efforts in places to depress Republican votes that we don't know about yet. I say that because the number of people who voted Democratic in those districts didn't increase. Democratic votes didn't go up in any statistical significant amount from the 3 previous elections. So it's not that the Democrats received more votes or people were dissatisfied with Sachs. We're looking at a few 100,000 votes in each of these states just disappearing." Turning to look out the window in her office, Patty tried to figure out what to do next. They'd known the Russians had interfered in the 2016 election with the dissemination of fake news articles through bots on social media. They'd tried to interfere in the 2018 election, along with China. Now it appeared a foreign power had actually succeeded in suppressing enough votes to change the outcome of a presidential election. What to do with that information, though? She wondered. "The president hasn't conceded the election yet," Neil said, interrupting her thoughts. "He shouldn't. It's clear that between these terrorist attacks and the evidence we have of the Chinese paying off these postal workers, our election was compromised. This needs to be challenged." Patty looked at him for a moment, not sure what to say. She knew he was right. It did need to be challenged. But how? She wondered. The Supreme Court has been wiped out. The Sixth Circuit Court wouldn't allow the president to delay the election to address these issues. So how could they be counted on to act now? She'd have to brainstorm this with the president's team in a couple of hours when she was set to meet with the president, the AG, and the FBI director. Washington, D.C., White House. The morning was ominous. Dark storm clouds had rolled in during the evening, providing the city with an exceptional lightning show and sheets of freezing rain. The cold torrents of water had pelted the White House, as if sending an unspoken message of things to come. At approximately 11:37 p.m. the night before, the major news networks had called the election for Senator Marshall Tate. With the unprecedented electoral switch of Texas, along with a clean sweep of Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida, Senator Marshall Tate had won by an enormous landslide in the Electoral College. Senator Marshall Tate had given a victory speech, hailing the win as a step forward for the common man and a rejection of the policies that had harmed the American economy and failed to protect them from international terrorism. While many people celebrated Tate's win, the state GOPs and the RNC began to analyze the voting data. They quickly found the same thing that the FEC chairman had discovered. Some group had influenced the election just enough to tip it. The president sat in the briefing room with many of his key cabinet members and advisors, doing his best to digest the information as best he could. The FBI and DHS had just presented what they all believed was a clear-cut case of foreign manipulation of the vote. The FBI had concluded that the timing of the Supreme Court justices being poisoned was almost fortuitous because it made it impossible for the president's case for postponing the election to be heard. When you added in the effects of what the postal workers had done with the absentee and mail-in ballots, and the coordination of these terrorist attacks and massive misinformation campaigns, it was obviously enough to change the outcome of the election. "This is unacceptable!" shouted the Secretary of Defense as he slammed his fist on the table. "We've got proof! The Chinese financed these terrorists that attacked us yesterday. proof that they paid these postal workers to carry out this scheme, and proof that for some unknown reason, someone in German intelligence provided the terrorists with the passports needed to gain entry into the U.S. Then, you add in the shenanigans that took place yesterday with that UN training exercise, and the Russians weaponizing social media and their misinformation campaign, and I think we've been hoodwinked. A foreign power just stole our election. A look of sheer horror spread across the faces of the people at the table. The sudden realization of what had happened was finally setting in. The president shook his head. The facts are the facts. We have proof of what happened. The question we have to answer now is what can be done about it. The Sixth Circuit blocked our EO to postpone the election. The Supreme Court justices were assassinated, so they can't hear the case. And Lord knows I can't just appoint all 9 justices overnight. So what do? He asked in exasperation. We take this to the D.C. Circuit. Attorney General Malcolm Wright responded. We need them to overturn the election and allow us to postpone it long enough to secure the voting process and know a vote can be held again without foreign interference. Rich Novella, the president's chief of staff, snorted. It's not that simple, he retorted. The perception is going to be that we're sore losers, that we can't accept the outcome of the election. So we're grasping at straws to find a way to say it was rigged. Except in this case, it was rigged, the Secretary of State shot back angrily. The Director for National Intelligence, who had largely just stayed quiet through these cabinet briefings, added, I don't care what the optics are. That's all being ginned up by the media and this massive disinformation campaign the Russians are running. What we know are the facts. The facts show us that multiple foreign powers interfered in our election with the sole intention of replacing President Sachs with a candidate of their choosing. Clearly, this plan has been in the works for many years, and it's been well coordinated and thought through, judging by the world's reaction to last night's results. Just look at how fast the global media and other governments have been dismissive of the intelligence we've been presenting to show that this election was being manipulated. You, Mr. President, need to take this bull by the horns and fix this. It's not going to be popular, and you're going to get a lot of pushback, but you're the president. You can't allow this to stand, or we won't be able to say with a straight face that any of our future elections will ever be fair and free of foreign interference or manipulation. The others in the room sat there for a moment, listening to the sage wisdom of the elder intelligence pro. They nodded their heads in agreement and turned to look at the president, waiting to see what he'd say in response. Lifting his chin up, the president made his decision. Okay, then here's what we're going to do. We're going to file a brief with the D.C. Circuit, asking that they nullify yesterday's election and reinstate our executive order that moves the election to January 4th. All voters must either vote in person or request a poll worker to assist them in using the iVote app, or in voting with an absentee ballot that will be counted at the time it's taken. We have to have a way to secure the election and know that it has not been tampered with. 3 hours later, Washington, D.C., White House. It was 4:47 p.m. Chief Justice Lawrence Buckley of the D.C. Circuit looked at the Director of the FBI, the Director for National Intelligence, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the President in a state of shock at what he'd just been told. Over the last 30 minutes, they had methodically laid out the evidence of the foreign manipulation and interference that had occurred up to that point. It all seemed surreal. A Chinese spy had facilitated the finances for a scheme involving postal workers, and Islamic extremists had infiltrated the country through financing from the Chinese and help from someone in the German BND. Good Lord. I hope that was just some rogue element and not an official action, Justice Buckley thought. He hadn't been all that shocked to hear about the misinformation campaign that had been led by the Russians after the October 24th attacks. But when they'd explained about the poisoning of the Supreme Court justices in order to prevent them from hearing about the president's executive order to delay the election, a chill had gone up his spine. And now they want me to hear this case? He thought. When he thought about the broader picture, Justice Buckley suddenly felt like he was going to be sick. The very fabric of the country was being torn apart right before his eyes, and he felt like there was almost no way to stop it from being ripped apart. He turned to President Sachs. "Have you told Senator Tate or any other congressional leaders about this, or what has taken place? We shared most of this with them when we filed our initial EO to postpone the election, but we haven't shared what we just showed you yet. We only just pieced it all together in the last 24 hours, Sachs responded. The president paused for a moment before adding, "We haven't conceded the election yet either. We know what happened, but we needed to find out from you, legally, what you believe should be our next course of action." Sachs paused for a second. "Look, I know you and I have not always agreed on policy. However, right now, we've presented you with verifiable proof that our election was improperly influenced. Votes were actually stolen and suppressed. I can accept defeat at the polls when it's been done fairly, but if we accept these fraudulent results now, I don't know that we'll ever be able to accept a future election as truly free and fair. Do you?" Lifting his head up, Justice Buckley looked at the ceiling for a moment to think. He stood up, but motioned for everyone to stay seated. He paced behind his chair briefly, and then looked out the window. Sachs was right that he didn't agree with the president's policies. On a personal level, he really didn't care for him as a leader at all, and Buckley had definitely used his position in the past to block certain presidential directives that he detested. However, President Sachs did have a point about being able to trust future elections. "If I let this stand and do nothing, I will be culpable for aiding in this subversion of our democracy," he realized. Justice Buckley took his seat again, then looked at the president. "I agree with you. This is unacceptable. There is no way we can say this was a free and fair election, considering the mountain of evidence that you have shown me. I want to have the video and transcripts of all the interrogations and the intelligence that you've collected on this up to this point. I need to independently review it myself and incorporate it into my judgment. This will need to be reviewed and ruled on by the full panel of the D.C. Circuit. I will issue a temporary injunction against the outcome of the election while we deliberate, which will halt the transition of power. We will endeavor to have a full decision reached by Friday at noon of this week." They all breathed a collective sigh of relief. The AG quickly asked, "Will you want us to present the case to the full panel?" Buckley shook his head. "No, I don't want to turn this into a circus. If I allow you to present information, I have to allow Senator Tate's team to present information also. What I would like is to have access to everyone for questioning by the justices, should they need clarification. We'll start deliberations tomorrow morning. Frankly, having seen the information you've shown us up to this point, I don't see how any of them could rule against us voiding the election and holding a new one on the previous date you had suggested. We may need to get Congress involved and get them to agree to the change also. But if they won't go along, I believe the judiciary branch can force the issue based solely on the evidence you've provided of the interference." The group talked for a bit longer about some of the evidence. Justice Buckley inquired about the sources and methods with which they'd obtained the information and where it had led them. The president also let him know that if the justices needed an elevation in security clearance to fully view the intelligence, he would make sure they had the access they needed. Later that evening, Cleveland, Ohio, Senator Tate's election HQ. The day after the election was proving to be just as exasperating and frustrating as Election Day. This should have been a day filled with joy and excitement of having just won the presidency. Instead, it was an anxious day of frustration and waiting. Despite the enormous electoral victory, President Sachs had still not conceded the race. Rumors began to spread that he had not accepted the loss and was scheming to find a way to stay in power. When the Chief Justice of the D.C. Circuit was spotted entering the White House, the rumors began to spread like wildfire. When Justice Buckley stayed at the White House for nearly 3 hours, the wait for information became almost unbearable. What the heck is going on? Why won't he just concede and admit he lost? Jerome Powell barked. He scowled angrily at the TV. Senator Tate plopped down in the chair next to him. He just wanted to talk about anything else. "Have we determined who we want for some of our key cabinet positions yet?" he asked. Jerome sighed and nodded. "We should seriously consider Jim Dowd for Treasury Secretary." Then he passed Marshall a dossier on Dowd. Jerome had built dossiers on the top 5 contenders for each of the cabinet positions they'd need to fill. His hope was that if he had these ready for Marshall the day after the election, they could get a jump on announcing their cabinet and get the transition rolling much quicker. They had a lot of work ahead of them. "Isn't Dowd the current CEO of UBS?" "He is," Jerome confirmed. "He's done a good job there. He's been one of Sachs's most outspoken trade critics. We'll need his expertise in reversing a lot of these sanctions and tariffs that are now in place with China and the EU. We have to get our economic house restored, and he's the best guy to do it. He's well respected in Europe and has a good working relationship with the Chinese." "Let me see the list of who you're considering for some of the other positions." Jerome nodded and handed him the list he'd meticulously built over the last few months. Each candidate had been interviewed and vetted secretly before being added. Marshall raised an eyebrow at the DHS choices. "You still have Riku Tanaka on the list?" he asked. "He's been a real asset to us during the campaign. Besides, his technological improvements and upgrades to the department's IT infrastructure have been incredible. He may be a part of the Sachs administration, but you know as well as I do, he's a progressive liberal. His personal interests are in bringing the government's IT infrastructure into the 21st century." "I don't disagree with you there," Marshall said. "I'd still like him to be a part of the administration. I'm just not sure he's really suited for that type of leadership position. He doesn't have any political experience, and, frankly, he's a bit of a nerd. No offense, but he doesn't come across as the type of person we'll need in that position. Not with the type of initiatives we're wanting to push through. Let's either leave him in his current position or find a way to put him in charge of the entire government's IT infrastructure." Jerome nodded. "I don't disagree with your assessment," he acknowledged. He turned a page. "I think we have some good choices for Secretary of Defense. What are your thoughts?" Marshall found the names. A smile crept across his face. "I like the idea of Admiral Hill. He's a real warrior's warrior." "He's no McElroy, but he did lead the Bin Laden raid and SOCOM during the previous administration, so he'll solidify our defense bona fides," Jerome asserted. "He could also allay some of the concerns about you being too soft on defense." Just as they were about to go over a few more names, one of Tate's senior advisors, Janie Roberts, walked in, madder than a hornet. "You won't believe the call I just got!" she exclaimed. Marshall tried to help her calm down. "Hey, Janie, it'll be okay. We just won the election, even if that SOB Sachs won't admit it." She softened her facial expression a bit. Well, there's a problem with that. I just got a phone call from our friend at DHS. He told me Chief Justice Lawrence Buckley is going to issue a temporary injunction against the results, halting the transition while the full panel of the D.C. Circuit rules on whether we won legitimately. Marshall almost exploded. What do you mean, if we won it legitimately? He's the one not accepting the results. Jerome placed a hand on Marshall's arm. Hang on, sir. I'm sure there's a way around this. Let's make a few calls and find out what's going on. The next 20 minutes went by in a flurry of activity and phone calls. They started calling in all sorts of markers and chits with people across the government and the judicial branch to find out whatever they could about what was going on.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.